Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our exhibition tour this morning for Uptown, Downtown, Richard Lindner's Fun City. I'm Dr. Gisela Carbonell, curator at the Rollins Museum of Art. If you are joining us and haven't heard, we have a new name, the Rollins Museum of Art here at Rollins College in Winter Park. And we are delighted to have you here this morning to walk through this exhibition with me. The exhibition Uptown, Downtown, Richard Lindner's Fun City will be on view until August 29th. So you can come see it in person. It's always free admission. And you can also explore the exhibition online, and I'll share the link with you at the end of our tour. So let's get started with our images. And I'll share a little bit with you about why this exhibition, why now, and what this exhibition is about before we take a deep dive into the artist's biography, his life and career, and the works that are included in this exhibition. So this exhibition happens to be on view on what would have been the 120th birthday of Richard Lindner, a German artist, German-American artist, whose work is created using a very special and unique visual language that is very much identifiable and consistent throughout his artistic career. And today we're going to be focusing on a portfolio of 14 prints that Richard Lindner created. He created these images between 1968 and 1969. They were shown at a very successful exhibition in New York City. And in 1971, the portfolio was published called Fun City. We have the complete portfolio here in our collection, and we are showing it in this exhibition for the first time, all the works together in one gallery. So it's an exhibition that celebrates the artist's legacy and career, and that looks at how an artist, in this case, Richard Lindner, with a very rich and interesting biography and story, created works that blend fine art, commercial illustration, popular culture, and the history of art. And we're going to be looking at some examples and looking at how he does that in specific works in just a second. And the gallery, the way that the gallery is painted and laid out, if you haven't seen it in person, the entire gallery is painted in this very deep, rich purple color that kind of evokes the theme of the portfolio, which is New York City, particularly the underbelly of the city, the nightlife in New York City. And so the color creates an environment in the gallery that is perhaps small and cozy and kind of evoking that environment in the nightlife in New York City in the 1970s. So Lindner was born in Hamburg, Germany. His mother was American, but of German descent, and his father was German. He lived and studied in Munich and Berlin, and these experiences in Munich and Berlin were important for the artist's artistic development and for the influences that will come through in his work later on in his life. He studied, among other things, he started studying music and then changed to study commercial illustration. And eventually in 1933, like so many other artists at this time in history, had to flee Germany and lived in Paris for a while. And this was another experience, as is the case with other artists, in which he was very much influenced by and in the context of other great artists who were working there in an environment of a lot of creativity and productivity that also played a role in his development. At this time, he works as a commercial illustrator, primarily for magazines and newspapers in France. This is the type of work that he was focused on, and also eventually when he leaves France and comes to New York City, comes to America and lives in New York City in 1941, he works as an illustrator for newspaper articles, magazines, books, a lot of well-known magazines, Harper Bazaar and others. And so for the earlier part of his life and career, he's focused on that, working with advertisement and illustration, and therefore his creative output is tied to the requirements and specifications of the publishers. It will not be until he is in his late 40s, early 50s that he will turn to art as in his own right, mostly as a painter and also as a draftsman, because he becomes a professor at a Pratt Institute, and I think he taught also a few classes at Yale University. So eventually he becomes a professor, and that allows him the financial freedom to not have to work as an illustrator and teach classes and then focus on creating his own art. And I'm showing you here one of the main images of the portfolio, Fun City, here on the left, and the gallery view here on the right. So you have an idea in terms of how the exhibition is installed and the kind of imagery that permeates this portfolio. And we're going to see through the examples that we're going to look at today that many of them are humorous. There's a lot of satire in these images, and Lindner works almost as a cultural critic, observing what's happening around him and creating images that are, yes, humorous and fun, but that also, when you start unpacking them, have a very interesting commentary about the times that he lived in and what he observed and experienced in New York. And New York becomes central for the artist's career and for his output. We see him here on the left with part of his collection. He collected toys and other things. And this is a quote that we included in the exhibition, is on the wall in the introductory text of the show. This is a quote that he gave in 1969 in an interview, right around the time when he was creating the images that would become the Fun City portfolio. And he says, "I am not really an American. I am a New Yorker, a product of New York, which anybody is after many years of living in the city and liking the city. In New York, everybody's a performer. The city is an enormous stage, 24 hours a day." And this quote captures so much of how Lindner took in the city and how he felt about what he saw and about what the environment was like at this time when he was living there. And this idea of the city being an enormous stage that is active and happening 24 hours a day, where everybody's a performer, is important for some of the images that we're going to see today in this context. And we see him here in 1967, working on the right, in 1972 on the left. And so even though he experimented with abstraction for a short period of time in his career, as you'll see, most of his work is figurative. He focuses on representations of the figure in different ways. We'll talk about that. I have some examples to share with you. And particularly in many of his images, we'll see female figures, mostly representations of female figures in very strong stances and dressed with in different and interesting ways. And that has something to do perhaps with his background and his biography, because his mother, at one point, she had a workshop, a store where they would make corsets and other garments for women. And so he grew up in this environment where corsets were a normal and regular thing, right? And so these elements that shape the body, that change the body, become key in his work. And it comes through in some of the images that we have in the exhibition. So there's some of his personal experience and personal history that comes through in these works, in this portfolio, but there's also an interest in history, in art history, and also combined with experimentation with other techniques. And these two works here are an example of that. So these two works, if you look at the gallery shot on the left, these are the two works that are on the right wall to the right. And these are lenticular prints. And these lenticular printing techniques had existed for decades before he started experimenting with lenticular prints and lenticular technology. But it's interesting to me that lenticular printing is usually employed to create or to convey or capture two images in one work, right? That depending on the angle that you look at it, you get to see either the image or the figure moving, or you get two different images in one object. Here, Lindner is using these lenticular sheets as the backdrop for the images that he creates that do not necessarily change, but the use of the lenticular sheets as backdrop give these images a kind of, I don't know, perhaps psychedelic look, very much of the time of the late 60s and early 70s. But nevertheless, he's exploring with different types of techniques and using different types of tools that he had at his disposal to explore and experiment how to portray some of the figures that perhaps he observed in New York, people that he would see maybe in different neighborhoods and in different places when he explored the city. And it's fascinating to read some of his interviews and some of the statements that he gave throughout his time in New York. He talks about walking through the city and going to places like department stores, particularly Macy's. He would go into Macy's and just walk around and observe how people interacted with each other and how people behave when shopping in a department store, and the characters that he would see there. How would people dress? How would they behave to go shopping there? There's an interview at one point where he calls Macy's the new Louvre, comparing it to the Louvre Museum in Paris, because there was so much there that he wanted to see, that he wanted to experience. And then he walked through Times Square in the evenings, also looking at the nightlife and taking it all in and observing the way that different people dress, the way that they behave, almost identifying different types in the city. And some of them, you see them in works like St. Mark's Place here on the right and Hit here on the left. So a lot of the figures have exaggerated features. In the case of women, sometimes exaggerated makeup or hair, or the way in which he represents them sometimes exaggerates some of their body parts. And for him, as he is creating these images, and I'm including here a page from a catalog where you can see some of the sketches and drawings that he worked with in preparation for this particular image. For him, drawing will remain for his entire career one of the most important ways to create images, because drawing for him, and this is what he said over and over in statements and interviews, drawing allowed him to make changes, to continue to add elements, to develop the image over time, to go back and redo it. So his interest lies more in the process than it is in the final image. So even though painting was also a very important the important thing for him to do. Painting, he felt, as he described it often, painting had to be final. He felt it had to be almost perfect. Whereas drawing is more about the process. It's more about bringing these influences, thinking about what he wanted to do, make changes, and see the image evolve over several attempts working with drawing. And we see this time and time again. There are thousands of drawings by Lindner that survive and that are in different collections and have been published, versus, I think, and I can find the number for you, I have it right here, yes, 114 paintings in his entire career, versus approximately 2,600 drawings. So that gives you a sense of where his interest was. In some of the images, and certainly some of the ones included in the Fun City portfolio, we see representations that seem playful and also erotic. There are a lot of juxtapositions of seeming opposites that come together in some of these images. And you see some of that here in On the left and The Girl with the Hoop on the right, where through the use of whether it's color or composition or typography, as in the case on the left, or even things like a hoop, a playful toy here associated with perhaps children, accentuate or emphasize elements of the figure, or the representation of the figure that can be interpreted as erotic. So these things are layered one on the other in many of his works, and certainly in some of the images here. And here on the left, I'm showing you 24-hour self-service, also included in the exhibition. And on the right, I'm including a drawing. I have a couple of other images of women that we're going to look at. But 24 hour self-service is a work that I'm drawn to a lot when I walk into the gallery and I see this work in the exhibition. Is an image that for me recalls some of the influences and the interests that Lindner had during his life and career, and particularly references perhaps to some of the avant-garde movements and avant-garde arts that he surely studied and experienced and witnessed when he was in Munich and Berlin, and eventually Paris, and certainly New York City as well. You know, works by Dadaist artists or Surrealist artists and others whose style may have created an impression on him. Here in 24-hour self-service, we see a woman in profile, and if you take a look at what she's wearing, she looks like someone who may be perhaps a superhero. She has this sort of helmet on her head, and her face is partially covered. Her makeup colors are not the traditional ones that we would see at this time in perhaps in magazine advertisements. Her clothing is a combination, and you see here on her left arm there's a huge zipper. It looks very rigid. It emphasizes her breasts, but at the same time there's almost a combination of elements here of what seem to be or could be perhaps military uniforms and mannequins. She looks very much like a mannequin. Perhaps there's this influence from his childhood, from his mother's store and workshop or studio, when he would see corsets and mannequins and different types of clothing elements for women. So almost like a mechanized type figure. It has this air of being futuristic. And then the use of lettering here, the 24-hour self-service, something that he must have seen in New York. And then the backdrop also adding to perhaps allusions to politics and other things that he may have experienced. And so it's an image that looks simultaneously vintage and futuristic. It looks like something out of a sci-fi, perhaps novel or movie, while also being of the moment and of his context. And here's another example also included in the exhibition. This one, including the signage for Uptown. And this female figure here shown frontally with this, again, this very kind of futuristic type of clothing with elements perhaps of Art Deco and maybe Art Nouveau. And you see her here with the checkered sunglasses. You can't really see her eyes or see her face. These figures are not intended to be portraits of specific people, but are more perhaps types that he would have seen in the city. And then the inclusion of the signage also is a big acknowledgement and nod to the city, to treat the city of New York in his work almost as another character, as another important protagonist of his work and his inspiration. And here on the left, another page from a catalog where we see some of the drawings for this work and others. But those drawings, you can see the evolution of the image as he adds elements and refines the concept and the composition, adding the signage, adding more elements to her clothing, particularly the element around the neck, and then working with these very bright and bold combinations and contrast of colors that look like posters for a sci-fi movie. And I wanted to mention that doing research for today's talk and researching this work for the exhibition, I came across an exhibition catalog of Lindner's that talked about how this particular one, the 24-hour self-service, and I don't know if this is absolutely confirmed, but it looked like from some documentation that exists that it was a commission by Hugh Hefner, that this image was commissioned by Hugh Hefner. Who knows? I don't know, but I read that somewhere about this particular piece. Just an interesting tidbit there. So we have been talking about how some of this imagery is very much of the moment, but it looks also futuristic. And I mentioned how Lindner was very much in tune with the history of art and also with the historical moment that he lived, but also that he studied and was influenced by earlier art. And I wanted to include a few images here of some of the other German artists who were working in the first few decades of the 20th century, whose work he may have witnessed, whether in Germany or in France or even later in New York City, because he did connect with some of these artists eventually. And I'm including here, of course, three of the biggest artists associated with Dadaism and some of these other avant-garde movements in the first part of the 20th century: Max Ernst, Hans Bellmer, and Hannah Hoch, for instance, all who have very interesting and innovative ways of treating the figure and also incorporating what was happening in Europe politically and socially with their own take on reality, and creating this distorted, perhaps, images and figures that reflected the chaos and the lack of stability during that time. Also influential for him is Fernand Léger, for instance, here on the left, his iconic piece, The City from 1919, and then artists like Giorgio de Chirico here on the right, who is very much of his moment, this one from 1915, but also looking at historical and earlier art from Europe in this case. And so all of these things converge. I'm not saying one influence specifically any particular work that we can identify, but these are all sources that he meaning Lindner, at one point or another talked about or signal that influence his work. And then he goes all the way back to the 15th century, to artists like Piero della Francesca or Giotto, and of course Dürer, as influences, as artists who he admired and whose art he took very seriously. So all of that comes together in some of these works. And especially remember, because he turns to painting when he is in his early 50s, he has a full career at that point already developed, and he is knowledgeable about these sources. Now, in terms of his personal experience beyond his work as an artist, it's a little bit difficult to perhaps identify a lot of things about his life, because in interviews he sometimes gives different information in different interviews. So sometimes it seemed like he preferred to keep his personal life a little bit more private, and in the process it's almost as if he created his own narrative, almost like a myth around himself as an artist and as a figure. But in terms of his artistic inclinations, all of these influences and sources play a role, and they're all there. And here I'm showing you another work in the exhibition. This one is called Out of Towners, and some of the drawings that he created for this work here on the left. And it's just, it makes me smile when I look at some of these images. Here you see this couple in profile with very exaggerated features, very exaggerated, bold, bright colors. And then we see the Statue of Liberty in the background. We see the statue in silhouette there, giving us the context, giving us enough information to know what the context is. Out of towners, because we are here in New York and this couple is coming from somewhere else. And so this figure's playful, again, in some cases, extremely bold and almost pushing the envelope of what the way that he represents these characters, perhaps still here with influences from the fashion magazines and other publications that he worked on prior to this period. And we have talked a lot about how he represents women and female figures in his work, but there are also representations of men included in this portfolio, and I'm showing you here the poet on the left and New York men on the right. And there is some speculation about who this poet is. Several art historians and curators have written about this work and trying to connect this image and who this person might be with who Lindner knew at the time, and who he had relationships and friendships with, trying to identify the figure. What I find most fascinating about this one, and I don't know who exactly this person might be, but what I find so interesting about this one is that it looks almost as if, you know, you're walking down the street and you look up perhaps to that first or second floor in a building in New York and you see someone looking out, right? And there's this other figure that's peeking behind the main figure in the foreground. And so the way in which this figure is represented is almost acknowledging us as the viewers, acknowledging our presence. And so it's interacting with us in a certain way, which I find a little bit different than some of the other images that we have looked at so far, because in the other ones, either the figures appear in profile, or if they appear represented frontally, they're wearing sunglasses. So their identity sometimes is concealed, their eyes are concealed, so we can't really engage with the figure in that way. The poet is a little bit different, and so I find it very intriguing for that. The one on the right, the New York men, Also, again, we go back to the figures either wearing sunglasses, the man in the foreground covering his face, right? So we may think about the figures on the right in the background that are not finished. We see the drawing there. We see the artist kind of leaving the image incomplete. And so I feel like it's an invitation to us as viewers to create the narrative for who these figures are. Who are these characters? What are they involved in? What are they doing? What is their role in the nightlife of New York City, right? And so I think these works are opening up to a dialogue with us as viewers. These are invitations and, in a sense, provocations by Lindner to engage with his viewers. And again, remember that he had been used to, for many years, working as an illustrator and as a commercial illustrator. His work had to speak to the reader, the viewer, to engage them through the image, whether it was about an article or a product that he wanted to convey. And so that kind of translates in these images in ways to create, to encourage and create a space for the viewer to sort of complete the story or create the story. He's definitely not giving us all the answers in these images. And in some of them, he alludes to specific locations. These two, for instance, also included in the exhibition, First Avenue on the left and Fifth Avenue on the right. And here he includes, almost as if collaging together different elements, male and female figures. You can see a businessman walking with his briefcase. You can see a few dogs, looks like a fire hydrant, and then these bright, bold signage for a pizza place on the left in First Avenue, and a little bit different environment perhaps in Fifth Avenue, with these figures in profile and the silhouetted figure, kind of ghostly apparition there in the background. And again, the clothing, which he refers to sometimes as an armor when he talks about clothing. He talks about clothing as a way of protecting, right? So very rarely did he represent nude figures, even when representing female figures, they're always clothed. Sometimes he, as we have seen, emphasizes the bare breasts of the figure. But again, this very robust, kind of bold representation of clothing as armor is interesting also in these portrayals. And then we have, as we have seen in some of the other examples we have looked at today, the inclusion of text, whether through signage taken from the city, from the business neon signs, like we just saw the pizza place sign, or directional signage like the Uptown one. There are other instances and other ways in which he includes signage, kind of plays around with words, with text, and other symbolism in some of these images. So this is Shoot, and we see here a couple with the fashion and the clothing very much of the moment. Again, exaggerated elements, and playing with words as a way to draw our attention here to the target, and then using a word like this one, which may have multiple meanings and connotations depending on the context. And here on the left, again, another catalog page with some of the drawings for this particular image. So if you have questions or if you have comments, if you have been to the gallery and have seen the exhibition, I would love to hear what you think. If you haven't been to the museum, you can still come see the exhibition until August 29th. It's free admission always here at the Rollins Museum of Art. And if you can't make it because you're far away or it's impossible for you to come see it in person, the best option would be to go on our website, rollins.edu/cfam, and then go to our exhibition page, and you can view a 360 virtual tour of the exhibition. I'm including here at the bottom right a top view of the gallery. And when you go to our page, you'll be able to manipulate the gallery and move around the camera so that you can see the works, and you can zoom in and have what is closest to the experience of being in person, even though we know it's not the same. But at least you can have an opportunity to see, to get a sense for what it feels like to be in the gallery and view the exhibition in place. So if you have any questions or any comments, I'd be more than happy to address them. So you can put them in the comment box. It has been a lot of fun to work on this exhibition, and I'm very excited to finally have the Lindner portfolio shown in its entirety in this context, and again celebrating what would have been his 120th birthday this year. So if we don't have any comments or any questions, okay, well, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I hope to see you very soon at the museum, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.